I'll take the company, the house, and the car. The old bum can keep the debts. My son-in-law said it so casually that for a second I thought I had misheard him. Then someone laughed. Then another person laughed. And before I knew it, the conference room was filled with quiet chuckles while I sat there staring at the polished oak table where my wife's will was about to be read. My daughter didn't defend me. She just looked down at her hands. "Jason, maybe that's enough," someone muttered. "Why?" Jason replied with a shrug. "I'm just being realistic." The room went silent for a moment, and I realized something that hurt even more than losing my wife. They all agreed with him. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Leave your city, your country, and your local time in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing where people are listening from. My name is Richard Walker. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of the day my family thought they had finally pushed me aside forever. What none of them realized was that they were laughing at the wrong man. And the lesson I learned from everything that happened is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. So stay with me until the end, and let me tell you how it all began. 3 weeks before that meeting, I stood in a cemetery just outside Austin, Texas, staring at a freshly covered grave. The November wind was cold enough to cut through my jacket. My wife, Margaret, had been gone for less than an hour when people started talking about assets. Not memories, not family, assets. I remember standing beside my daughter Emily after the service. She had her arm linked with her husband Jason's. "Dad, you should let Jason help with the business," she said softly. "There's going to be a lot to manage." I looked at her, surprised. "Your mother was buried 30 minutes ago." Emily glanced away. Jason stepped forward. "We're just trying to help." "Help with what?" I asked. "The future," he answered. "Someone needs to think about it." At the time, I told myself they were grieving in their own way. People say strange things after a loss. That's what I wanted to believe. But over the next few days, little things started happening. Employees who had worked for me for 20 years stopped calling me directly. Questions about company decisions suddenly went through Jason. Meetings appeared on calendars that I wasn't invited to. One afternoon I drove to the office. Walker Construction had occupied the same brick building for nearly 3 decades. I still remembered signing the lease with Margaret back when we only had 6 employees and 1 pickup truck. When I walked inside, I heard Jason's voice coming from the conference room. "We're going to need new leadership moving forward," he was saying. The door was slightly open. I stopped. "Richard's not really involved anymore," Jason continued. "We'll be making changes after the estate process is finished." Someone asked, "Does Richard know about this?" Jason laughed. "He'll understand eventually." I stood there for several seconds before quietly turning around and leaving. I didn't confront him. I didn't say a word. Maybe I should have. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe losing Margaret had taken more out of me than I realized. That night I sat alone in our kitchen. Her favorite coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink. I couldn't bring myself to move it. The house felt too quiet. 45 years of marriage leaves echoes in every room. Then my phone rang. It was Sarah, my younger daughter. "Dad," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." There was a long pause. Why does Jason keep acting like he already owns everything? I stared out the kitchen window into the darkness. "I was hoping you could tell me." Sarah lowered her voice. "Something feels off." "What do you mean?" Another pause. "Mom told me something about the company last year. I didn't understand it at the time." I sat up straighter. What exactly did she say? But before Sarah could answer, she suddenly stopped speaking. Then I heard another voice in the background. Jason's voice. And the next thing she whispered sent a chill down my spine. "Dad, I don't think anyone knows what Mom really did." Sarah's words stayed with me long after the call ended. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, staring at Margaret's coffee mug and thinking about everything that had happened over the years. The truth is, none of what Jason was doing appeared overnight. Looking back, the signs had been there for a very long time. Emily had always been the child who wanted everyone to be happy. Even when she was little, she hated conflict. If another kid took her toy at school, she would rather walk away than argue. Sarah was different. She asked questions. She noticed things. Margaret used to laugh and say, "One daughter got my patience. The other got my instincts." For years, our family felt solid. We had Sunday dinners, summer barbecues, Thanksgiving gatherings that lasted all day. The grandkids played football in the backyard while Margaret made enough food for 20 people even when only 10 showed up. Those were good years. Then Jason entered the picture. The first time I met him was at a restaurant near the University of Texas. He arrived 20 minutes late and spent most of dinner talking about himself. "I have big plans," he told me. "I do not think small." Emily smiled at him like he hung the moon. Margaret squeezed my arm under the table and gave me that look that meant do not start. So I stayed quiet. A few years later, when Jason joined Walker Construction, I tried to give him a fair chance. "Everybody deserves an opportunity," Margaret said. "Maybe he will surprise you." At first, things seemed fine. He worked hard. He dressed well. He knew how to speak confidently in meetings. Clients liked him. But there were small moments that bothered me. One afternoon, I walked into the office break room and heard him talking to a younger employee. "You need to think bigger," Jason said. "Richard built a nice company, but it is time for modern leadership." The employee looked uncomfortable when he noticed me standing there. Jason just smiled. "Richard, I was just complimenting what you built." It sounded polite. Somehow it never felt polite. Over time, Margaret started defending him more often. "He is ambitious," she would say. "That is not a crime." "No," I would answer. But ambition without gratitude usually becomes something else. She never argued. She would just get quiet. The strange thing was that Sarah noticed it too. About 2 years before Margaret passed away, Sarah and I were cleaning up after Christmas dinner. Everyone else had left. She was stacking plates when she suddenly said, "Dad, does Jason ever make you nervous?" I looked at her. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged. "Because whenever he talks about the company, he talks like it already belongs to him." I remember laughing at the time. "That would be difficult." "Why?" she asked. "Because things are not always what they look like." She stopped drying a plate and looked directly at me. "What does that mean?" Before I could answer, Margaret walked into the kitchen carrying leftover pie. The conversation ended right there. I had almost forgotten about that moment until now. Sitting alone in my kitchen years later, I realized Sarah had been seeing pieces of the puzzle long before anyone else. The next morning, I drove to the office earlier than usual. The parking lot was nearly empty. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed something taped to the inside of the glass door. It was a draft organizational chart for the company. At the very top was Jason's name. My name was nowhere on the page. And suddenly, for the first time, I began to wonder whether Margaret had known this day was coming long before the rest of us did. I stood there staring at that organizational chart for a long moment. My name was gone. 30 years of work, thousands of early mornings, hundreds of contracts, and somehow I had vanished from a company I built with my own hands. A few years earlier, I would have walked straight into the conference room and demanded answers. That was my old habit. Solve the problem immediately. Confront it head on. But that morning, I did something different. I pulled out my phone, took a picture of the chart, and quietly walked back to my office. For the first time, I decided to watch instead of react. Around 9 o'clock, employees started arriving. A few stopped by my office. One of them was Mike Henderson, a project manager who had been with us for nearly 18 years. He closed the door behind him. "Richard, can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated. "Are you retiring?" I looked at him. "Why would you ask that?" Mike shifted uncomfortably. "People have been talking. Jason has been telling everyone that there will be a leadership transition after the estate is settled." I leaned back in my chair. "Has he now?" Mike nodded. Most of us did not know what to think. For some reason, that conversation gave me clarity. The company still trusted me. The employees were not pushing me out. They were confused. Someone else was creating that confusion. Later that afternoon, I attended a meeting with one of our largest commercial clients. Normally, Jason handled those presentations, but the client specifically requested that I be there. Halfway through the meeting, the client smiled and pointed at me. "Richard, we only signed this contract because of your reputation." Jason's expression tightened for just a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. "Well," Jason said quickly, "the next generation is ready to take things even further." The client chuckled. "Maybe. But trust takes years to build." On the drive home, I thought about that comment. Trust takes years to build. The truth was that Walker Construction had never been about buildings. It had always been about relationships. Margaret understood that better than anyone. That evening, Sarah came by the house carrying takeout from my favorite barbecue place. We sat on the back porch as the Texas sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired." She studied me for a moment. "You are also thinking too much." I laughed. "That part is true." For a while we just sat there. Then she finally spoke again. "Dad, there is something else." My stomach tightened. "Go ahead." "Emily and Jason have been meeting with Mom's financial advisor." I looked up. "Since when?" "Months." I frowned. "Before Mom passed?" Sarah nodded. "I only found out recently." That did not make sense. Margaret handled some personal investments, but major decisions were always discussed together. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Positive." She lowered her voice. "Emily thinks Jason is protecting her future." "And what do you think?" Sarah stared into the distance. "I think Jason is preparing for something." The next morning, I received a call from attorney Benjamin Reed. He had been our family lawyer for more than 20 years. His tone was calm, but something about it felt unusual. "Richard," he said, "the will reading has been scheduled for Friday afternoon." "All right." There was a brief silence. Then he added, "There are a few things we should discuss afterward." "About Margaret's estate?" Another pause. "About several things." Before I could ask another question, he politely ended the call. I sat there staring at the phone in my hand, and for the first time, I began to suspect that Margaret had left behind far more than anyone in the family realized. Benjamin's phone call stayed in my mind for the rest of the week. The way he had paused before choosing his words. The way he sounded careful. Not worried. Careful. By Thursday morning, I could feel something shifting around me. It was subtle at first. A conversation that stopped when I entered a room. A glance exchanged between people who suddenly became interested in their coffee cups. Then the rumors started reaching me directly. I was walking through the office when Linda, our receptionist of nearly 15 years, caught up with me. "Richard, can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Sure." She looked embarrassed. "People are saying you are selling your ownership stake after the estate is settled." I stopped walking. "Who told them that?" She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "Jason?" I asked. She nodded. "He said the family had already agreed on a transition plan." For a moment I just stood there. Not because I was angry, because I was stunned. Nobody had asked me about any transition plan. Nobody had discussed selling anything. Yet somehow people were speaking about it as if it had already happened. Later that afternoon, I received another surprise. An old client named Walter Simmons called me personally. Walter had done business with us for almost 20 years. "Richard, I wanted to congratulate you," he said. "On what?" There was a pause. "The retirement." I closed my eyes. "Walter, I am not retiring." Silence. "You are not?" "No." Another long pause followed. "Well, somebody has been telling people otherwise." After the call ended, I sat alone in my office staring at the wall. Lies move faster than truth. That is one thing life teaches you. A lie only needs to sound reasonable. The truth usually needs evidence. That evening, Emily invited me to dinner. I almost declined, but part of me hoped we could talk honestly. The restaurant was crowded. Jason arrived wearing the confident smile he seemed to reserve for situations where he thought he was winning. Halfway through the meal, he leaned back in his chair. "We need to think about stability," he said. "For the family. For the company." I looked at him. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means people need leadership." Emily nodded slightly beside him. "Dad, Jason is only trying to help." "Help with what?" I asked. Jason folded his hands. "You have been through a lot. Nobody expects you to carry everything forever." It sounded compassionate. That was the genius of it. Every insult arrived disguised as concern. "I appreciate your concern," I replied, "but I am still capable of making my own decisions." Jason smiled politely. "Of course." Yet something in his eyes said he did not believe that at all. On the drive home, I received a text from Sarah. "Call me when you get home. It is important." The moment I walked through my front door, I called her. She answered immediately. "Dad, I found something." "What?" Her voice dropped. "Emily has been telling relatives that Mom wanted Jason to run the company." I felt my stomach sink. Margaret never said that. "I know." "Who believes this?" Sarah laughed sadly. "Almost everyone." I sat down heavily at the kitchen table. The lie had spread further than I realized. Family members, friends, employees, clients. One story repeated often enough had become accepted as fact. Then Sarah said something that made my blood run cold. "Dad, there is more." "What?" "The will reading packet was delivered today." I frowned, and her voice trembled. "Jason somehow already knows what everybody expects to receive." The room suddenly felt smaller. That should not be possible. That is exactly what I thought. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Dad, I think they have been planning this for much longer than we realized." And at that moment, sitting alone in the house I had shared with Margaret for 45 years, I felt the ground beneath my family begin to crack. The next few days were some of the loneliest of my life. Not because I was physically alone. People were everywhere. Employees, relatives, neighbors, business contacts. The problem was that nobody seemed to be talking to me anymore. They were talking about me. There is a difference, and it is a painful one. On Saturday morning, I decided to start fixing the situation before it got worse. I opened my laptop and spent nearly 2 hours writing emails. The first went to the senior management team at Walker Construction. I kept it simple. I explained that I was still actively involved in the company and that no leadership transition had been finalized. I thought that would clear things up. By noon, I had received 3 replies. The first said, "Thank you for the clarification." The second said, "We appreciate the update." The third was from a manager I had personally hired 12 years earlier. His message was only 1 sentence long. "We were told a different version of events." I read that sentence 3 times. We were told a different version of events. Not I heard. Not I assumed. We were told. Someone had been actively shaping the story. That afternoon, I called Emily. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hi, Dad." Her voice sounded cautious. "Emily, we need to talk." Silence. "About what?" "About everything." Another pause. "Jason and I are really busy right now." I closed my eyes. Busy with what? The estate process. The future. A lot of things. Your mother has not even had her will read yet. She sighed. "Dad, you are making this harder than it needs to be." That sentence hit harder than she probably realized. Harder than it needs to be. As if my confusion was the problem. As if my questions were creating the tension instead of the rumors spreading through the family. "Emily," I said quietly, "do you believe I should be involved in decisions about my own company?" She did not answer immediately. That silence told me more than any words could have. "I have to go," she finally said. Then the line went dead. Sunday morning, I found myself doing something I had not done in years. I wrote a letter by hand. Margaret used to say that important things deserved ink instead of keyboards. So I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a personal letter to both of my daughters. Not about money, not about ownership, about family, about trust, about how quickly misunderstandings can become permanent if people stop listening to each other. I mailed the letters that afternoon. Sarah called me that evening. "I got yours already," she said. "Thank you." "Did Emily get hers?" "Yes." "What did she say?" Sarah hesitated. "Nothing yet." 2 days later, I received my answer. Not from Emily. From Jason. A text message appeared on my phone. "We received your letter. Everyone agrees that moving forward is the healthiest option for the family." I stared at the screen. Everyone agrees. Those 2 words bothered me more than anything else. Because nobody had actually asked me. Somehow, decisions were being made about my future while I was still sitting at the table. By Wednesday, even longtime family friends were treating me differently. One neighbor stopped me while I was checking the mailbox. "I hear you are finally slowing down," he said. Another smiled and asked, "How does retirement feel?" The story had spread so far that correcting it felt impossible. Every conversation felt like arriving late to a meeting where everyone else had already reached a conclusion. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The television was on, but I was not really watching it. Margaret's favorite chair sat empty across from me. My phone remained silent. No calls from Emily. No invitations, no explanations. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles into a house after people stop seeing you as part of the future. And as darkness filled the room around me, I realized something that frightened me more than losing the company ever could. I was beginning to lose my family too. The days leading up to the will reading felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. The kind of empty that settles in after a storm has stripped the leaves from a tree. I found myself waking up before sunrise and sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at the backyard through the same window Margaret had looked through every morning for years. Sometimes I would reach for a second coffee mug before remembering there was no reason to. One morning I actually poured 2 cups before catching myself. I stood there looking at the extra cup for several seconds. Then I poured it down the sink. That hurt more than I expected. The truth was that losing Margaret had been painful enough. Watching my family slowly drift away afterward felt like losing her all over again. Sarah still called every few days. She was the only one who did. One evening she stopped by with groceries. I had not asked for help. She simply noticed my refrigerator was nearly empty. "You need to take better care of yourself," she said as she unpacked bags onto the counter. "I am managing." She gave me a look. "Dad, surviving and managing are not the same thing." I laughed quietly. "Your mother used to say that." For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was sad. Sarah eventually sat across from me at the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "Why are you still trying so hard with everyone?" I thought about that. "Because they are my family." "Even now?" I nodded. "Especially now." She looked down at her hands. "I am not sure they deserve that." After she left, I sat alone for a long time thinking about her question. For weeks I had been trying to repair relationships that only seemed to move farther away. Every phone call felt one-sided. Every message felt unanswered. Every attempt to explain myself seemed to strengthen assumptions people had already chosen to believe. Then, a realization finally hit me. It was not dramatic. It was not some grand moment of revelation. It was simple. I had been acting as though misunderstanding was the problem. But misunderstanding was not the problem anymore. People had already made their choices. That realization hurt, yet it also brought a strange sense of calm. The next morning I drove to the cemetery. The grass around Margaret's grave had already begun settling into place. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets while a cool breeze moved through the trees. "I miss you," I said quietly. It felt foolish talking out loud. Then again, after 45 years of marriage, silence felt even stranger. I looked down at the headstone. "I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell me." A memory surfaced unexpectedly. About a year before she passed away, Margaret and I had been sitting on our back porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the horizon. Out of nowhere, she had said, "Richard, promise me something." "What?" "If people ever disappoint you, do not spend all your energy trying to convince them who you are." I remember laughing at the time. "That sounds oddly specific." She smiled. "Just promise me." Standing there at the cemetery, I finally understood. For weeks I had been trying to prove myself to people who already knew me. I had been defending a reputation built over decades against stories only a few weeks old. The problem was never a lack of evidence. The problem was that some people preferred the newer story. As I walked back toward my truck, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Benjamin Reed. The will reading was scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Please arrive 30 minutes early. There was nothing unusual about the message. Yet for some reason, as I read those words, I felt the first spark of something I had not felt in a long time. Not confidence, not relief, just curiosity. Because for the first time in weeks, I had the feeling that the story everyone believed was about to collide with the truth. The morning of the will reading arrived with clear skies and unusually cool weather for Austin. I woke up before my alarm and sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel the urge to call anyone, explain anything, or defend myself. There was a strange peace in that. Around 9 o'clock, I drove to the office. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The building looked exactly the same as it had the day before, yet something felt different. As I walked through the front door, several employees greeted me. "Morning, Richard." "Good to see you, Richard. How are you doing?" Small things. Ordinary things. But they reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. My life was larger than the rumors surrounding it. Mike Henderson knocked on my office door shortly after I arrived. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always." He stepped inside carrying a folder. The new apartment project came through. I looked up. "The Riverside project?" He nodded. 240 units. They approved the proposal. For a moment, I just stared at him. We had spent months preparing that bid before Margaret got sick. "That is great news." Mike smiled. "The client specifically asked whether you would still be involved." I laughed softly. And what did you tell them? The truth. He handed me the folder. I told them nobody knows this business better than you. After he left, I sat quietly looking through the paperwork. It struck me that while certain people were busy planning my future, my actual future was still moving forward without their permission. The company was still winning contracts. Clients were still calling. Employees were still doing good work. The world had not ended. Around lunchtime, Sarah called. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Better than I expected." "Really? Really?" She sounded relieved. "Good." Then she hesitated. "Emily called me this morning." I waited. "And?" Sarah sighed. "She thinks today is going to solve everything." "Does she?" "I do not think she realizes how much damage has already been done." Neither did I. If I was being honest, some things break slowly. You only notice the cracks after they spread. Before hanging up, Sarah said something that stayed with me. "Dad, whatever happens this afternoon, remember who you are." Simple words, but they mattered. At 1 o'clock, I left the office and drove toward Benjamin Reed's law firm downtown. The closer I got, the calmer I felt. Not because I knew what was coming, because I finally understood something Margaret had been trying to teach me. My identity was not tied to other people's opinions. It never had been. When I arrived, several cars were already parked outside. I recognized most of them. Family members, relatives, people who had suddenly become very interested in estate matters over the past few weeks. Inside the lobby, conversations immediately quieted when I entered. A few people offered polite smiles. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Sarah walked over and hugged me. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so." "Good." She squeezed my arm. "Just remember, Mom was smarter than all of us." That made me smile. Because it was true. Margaret had always been the smartest person in the room. A few minutes later, Benjamin appeared from the hallway. His expression was professional as always, but there was something else there too. Confidence. "Richard," he said, "would you come with me for a moment before everyone sits down?" I followed him into a private office. He closed the door behind us. Then he opened a thick file and placed it carefully on the desk between us. "Before we begin," he said, looking directly at me, "there is something your wife specifically instructed me not to reveal until today." And the moment I saw the first document inside that file, I realized Margaret had been planning for this day far longer than anyone knew. Benjamin did not immediately explain what I was looking at. He simply turned the document toward me and let me read. At the top of the page was a corporate registration record dated nearly 26 years earlier. I recognized the signatures instantly. Mine, Margaret's, and Benjamin's. Then I saw the ownership section. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "You remember this now?" Benjamin asked quietly. I nodded slowly. The memory came rushing back. Walker Construction had been a tiny company back then. We were working out of a rented office no bigger than a 2-car garage. Money was tight. Every dollar mattered. I remembered sitting at a folding table late one evening while Margaret reviewed paperwork. "Richard," she had said, sliding a document toward me. "Sign here?" "What is it?" "Protection." I laughed. "That is not a legal term." She smiled. "Then let your lawyer explain it." Benjamin had spent an hour walking us through different ownership structures. Most of it had gone over my head at the time because I was more worried about making payroll the following week. Looking back now, Margaret had understood every detail. She always did. She insisted on it, Benjamin said. More than once. I looked up. Why? He leaned back in his chair. Because she believed that one day people might confuse visibility with ownership. I stared at him. That sounds exactly like something she would say. Benjamin smiled faintly. It does. He opened another folder. Inside were years of records. Amendments, agreements, authorizations. Every major decision carefully documented. Margaret had apparently spent decades making sure the company could survive any future misunderstanding. The realization hit me harder than I expected. For weeks, I had been grieving the loss of my wife. Now I was being reminded of the woman she had always been. Thoughtful, patient, 3 steps ahead of everyone else. There is more, Benjamin said. He handed me another document. This one contained a personal letter addressed to me. I immediately recognized Margaret's handwriting. My hands actually trembled as I unfolded it. The letter was short. She wrote that she loved me. She wrote that she trusted me. Then she wrote something that made me laugh despite everything that had happened. If you are reading this, she had written, then somebody is probably making assumptions again. I shook my head and smiled. That sounds like her. Yes, Benjamin replied. It does. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not vindication. Something steadier than that. Confidence. The confidence that comes from finally standing on solid ground after spending too long in uncertainty. I looked down at the brass nameplate on Benjamin's desk reflecting sunlight from the window. Then I looked at the company documents in front of me. My name was there. Not hidden, not implied. Clearly documented across decades of records. The strange thing was that the paperwork itself mattered less than what it represented. For weeks, I had been allowing other people to define my role, my value, and my future. Sitting there in that office, I remembered something important. My life had not been built by rumors. It had been built by work. Early mornings, long weekends, risks, sacrifices, relationships. Thousands of ordinary decisions made consistently over 30 years. Nobody could erase that. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Benjamin's assistant opened the door slightly. Everyone is seated. Benjamin nodded. Thank you. The assistant disappeared. Benjamin gathered the files carefully and stood. Are you ready? He asked. I looked down one final time at Margaret's letter before folding it neatly and placing it inside my jacket pocket. Yes, I said. And for the first time since her funeral, I truly meant it. A few moments later, we stepped into the hallway and began walking toward the conference room where the rest of the family was waiting, completely unaware that the version of the future they had already accepted was about to meet reality. The conference room was larger than I remembered. Maybe it only felt that way because everyone was already seated when I walked in. Conversation softened, chairs shifted. A few people glanced up briefly before looking away again. I noticed relatives I had not spoken to in years. A couple of business associates, family friends. Everyone seemed unusually interested in what was about to happen. Sarah gave me a small nod from across the room. I returned it and took my seat near the end of the table. Jason was sitting beside Emily. He looked comfortable, relaxed. The kind of relaxed that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. Benjamin entered a minute later carrying several folders. He placed them neatly in front of him and adjusted his glasses. The room slowly became quiet. I looked around the table. What struck me most was not the tension. It was the certainty. Most people seemed convinced they already knew how the afternoon would unfold. For weeks, assumptions had been repeated often enough to become accepted facts. The reading itself began with routine legal language. Names, dates, formalities. Benjamin's voice remained calm and professional. Every so often someone shifted in their chair, someone else checked their watch. Then I noticed Jason leaning forward. He was paying attention now, very close attention. At one point, a cousin spoke up. So after everything is finalized, who handles the company operations? Benjamin did not immediately answer. We will address all relevant matters in order. The cousin nodded and sat back. Jason smiled faintly. Emily looked relieved. I sat quietly. For the first time in weeks, I felt no need to interrupt anyone. No need to argue. No need to correct assumptions. Benjamin continued reading. Various personal items were mentioned. Family keepsakes. Charitable donation. Specific gifts Margaret had carefully planned years earlier. Several people smiled at certain memories. Others became emotional. For a few moments it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a reflection of who Margaret had been. Then the atmosphere shifted. The conversation turned toward larger assets. I could almost feel people sit a little straighter. One relative cleared his throat. Another folded his arms. Across the table, Jason exchanged a quick glance with Emily. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Benjamin opened another folder. The room became noticeably quieter. Before proceeding further, he said, it is important that everyone understands the legal structure surrounding several holdings connected to Margaret Walker. The wording immediately caught my attention. Connected to. Not owned by. Connected to. I noticed Sarah catch the distinction too. Her eyes moved toward me briefly. Jason, however, appeared completely confident. That should simplify things, he said. I think everyone already understands the general situation. Benjamin looked up slowly. I would advise against making assumptions. A few people exchanged uncertain looks. The confidence around the room seemed to weaken slightly. Not disappear, just weaken. Jason leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Fair enough, yet his tone suggested he was merely waiting for formal confirmation of what he already believed. Benjamin reached into the folder beside him and removed several documents. My heart remained surprisingly calm. A week earlier, I would have been nervous. Now I simply watched. The balance of the room had already begun changing. Most people had not realized it yet. They still believed they understood the story. They still believed they knew who held influence, who held authority, and who would walk away with control. Benjamin carefully arranged the papers in front of him. Then he looked directly at the group. "There is one matter," he said, "that must be clarified before we discuss the remainder of the estate." The room fell completely silent. Jason's expression never changed. Emily looked hopeful. Sarah looked concerned. I sat motionless with Margaret's letter folded inside my jacket pocket. Then Benjamin placed the first document on the table, looked up, and prepared to reveal the one fact that would change everything. Benjamin rested his hand on the document for a moment before speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner overhead. "Before discussing any distribution of assets," he said, "there is a legal issue that requires clarification." Jason leaned forward slightly. "What kind of issue?" Benjamin looked down at the paperwork. "Ownership." A few people exchanged confused glances. Emily frowned. "Ownership of what?" Benjamin calmly turned the first page toward the group. "Walker Construction." The reaction was immediate but subtle. Not panic, not shock, just uncertainty. The kind that appears when people suddenly realize they may not understand a situation as well as they thought. Jason gave a small laugh. "I am not sure why that is complicated." Benjamin looked directly at him. "Because the company was never owned by Margaret Walker." The room went completely still. Nobody spoke. For a second, I thought someone might ask Benjamin to repeat himself. Instead, everyone simply stared. Emily blinked several times. "What do you mean?" she asked. Benjamin folded his hands together. "I mean exactly what I said. Margaret Walker was never the legal owner of Walker Construction." Jason's confidence finally wavered. "Just a little. That cannot be right." Benjamin slid another document across the table. "These are the original registration records, along with every subsequent amendment." Jason immediately reached for them. Emily leaned over his shoulder. Around the room, relatives began exchanging confused looks. "There has to be some mistake," Jason said. "There is no mistake." Benjamin's tone remained perfectly calm. "The ownership structure has remained unchanged for more than 2 decades. Nobody seemed interested in the will anymore. Every eye in the room was now fixed on those documents." Emily looked up. "If Mom did not own it, then who did?" Benjamin did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder and removed a second set of records. Then he turned toward me. "Richard, would you mind standing for a moment?" I looked at him, then slowly rose from my chair. The room followed the movement. Suddenly, people were looking at me differently. Not with sympathy, not with concern, with curiosity. Benjamin placed the documents on the table. "The sole controlling owner of Walker Construction has always been Richard Walker." Nobody spoke. Sarah lowered her eyes for a second, as though she had finally received confirmation of something she had suspected for years. Emily looked genuinely stunned. Jason stared at the paperwork, then back at me, then back at the paperwork again. "No," he said quietly. "That does not make sense." Benjamin nodded toward the records. "The documentation is complete." Jason's voice tightened. "Margaret handled company matters all the time." "She certainly did," Benjamin replied. "But handling operations and holding ownership are not the same thing." Another silence followed. This one felt heavier. Across the table, one relative slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another leaned back in his chair as though trying to process what he had just heard. The assumptions that had seemed so solid only minutes earlier were beginning to collapse. Emily finally turned toward me. "Dad." She stopped. For the first time in weeks, she seemed unsure what to say. I met her eyes but did not speak. There was nothing left to explain. The documents were doing that work for me. Benjamin opened the final folder. "There is one additional matter everyone should understand." Jason looked up sharply. "Additional matter?" Benjamin nodded. "Yes." He carefully removed a sealed envelope and placed it on the table. The envelope contained Margaret's final written instructions regarding several major assets. As Benjamin broke the seal and unfolded the contents, I watched the color slowly drain from Jason's face. Because whatever he had expected to happen that afternoon, it clearly was not this. Benjamin unfolded the letter and adjusted his glasses. Nobody interrupted him. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone now. In its place was something far less comfortable: uncertainty. This document was written and signed by Margaret Walker 18 months ago, Benjamin said. It was witnessed, notarized, and placed into legal custody under her instructions. He glanced down and began reading. Margaret's words were simple and direct. She explained that certain assets had been intentionally separated from her estate because they were never hers to distribute. She wrote that ownership records, trust agreements, and corporate filings already reflected that reality. Then came the part that changed the atmosphere entirely. She wrote that any future leadership decisions involving Walker Construction would remain solely under my authority unless I personally chose otherwise. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Across the table, Emily slowly lowered her eyes. Jason remained completely still. Benjamin continued. Margaret explained that she had made these arrangements years earlier because she believed ownership should remain connected to responsibility. She wrote that the people who sacrificed to build something should never lose control of it through assumptions, pressure, or convenience. Hearing those words felt like hearing her voice again. Calm, thoughtful, certain. When Benjamin finished reading, the room remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Emily looked toward me. Dad, did you know all of this? Her voice sounded smaller than usual. Not every detail, I answered honestly. Your mother handled more planning than I realized. Emily nodded slowly. She seemed to be processing more than legal information. She seemed to be reconsidering the entire story she had accepted over the past few weeks. Jason finally cleared his throat. There must have been some misunderstanding. Benjamin looked at him. The documentation is quite clear. That is not what I meant. Jason shifted in his chair. I mean, everyone believed something different. For the first time all afternoon, I decided to speak directly. Believing something does not make it true. The room became quiet again. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Jason opened his mouth as though preparing another response, then stopped. There was nothing left to argue with. The records existed. The signatures existed. The instructions existed. Facts have a way of ending conversations that opinions cannot. A cousin across the table shook his head slowly. I think we all made assumptions. Nobody disagreed. Sarah looked at me and gave a faint smile. Not a triumphant smile. A relieved one. The kind people wear when reality finally catches up to confusion. A few minutes later, the formal meeting ended. Chairs began moving. Papers were collected. Small conversations started forming around the room. Yet the energy had completely changed. People who had arrived expecting certainty now seemed unsure of everything. Emily approached me near the doorway. Dad. I turned toward her. She looked exhausted. I should have talked to you, instead of listening to everyone else. I nodded. Probably. Her eyes filled with regret. I never wanted things to become like this. I know. And I believed her. That was the difficult part. Not everyone who hurts you intends to. Sometimes people simply choose the easier story. We stood there for a moment before she quietly asked, "Can we talk later?" I considered the question carefully. A few weeks earlier, I would have said yes immediately. This time I answered differently. Later, perhaps. But not today. She nodded. No argument. No protest. Just acceptance. It was the first healthy boundary I had set in a very long time. As people gradually left the conference room, I remained near the window looking out over downtown Austin. The legal questions had been answered. The assumptions had been corrected. Yet something still felt unfinished. Because while documents can settle ownership, they cannot instantly repair trust. And as I watched the last few family members gather their belongings and leave, I realized the hardest part of this story was not behind us yet. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. Not easier, just quieter. There is a difference. Some people imagine that once the truth comes out, everything immediately falls back into place. Real life does not work that way. Trust takes years to build and only moments to damage. The legal questions had been resolved, but the emotional ones remained. Walker Construction continued moving forward. The Riverside project broke ground that spring. New contracts followed. Employees seemed more relaxed. Clients stopped asking uncertain questions. Stability returned one ordinary day at a time. As for me, I stopped trying to control things that were no longer mine to control. Emily and I eventually began talking again. Not all at once. Not through one dramatic conversation. It started with a phone call, then lunch, then another conversation a few weeks later. Some wounds heal like broken bones. Others heal like old scars. They never completely disappear, but they stop controlling your life. Jason resigned from the company several months afterward. There was no public conflict, no dramatic scene. He simply moved on to other opportunities. I wished him well. That surprised some people. It even surprised me. But carrying resentment is exhausting. At 72 years old, I had no interest in spending my remaining years arguing with the past. Sarah remained close. In many ways, the experience strengthened our relationship. One evening, we sat together on the same back porch where Margaret and I had spent so many evenings over the years. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Mom would be proud of you," Sarah said quietly. I smiled. "I'm not sure about that." She laughed. "Dad, she absolutely would." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added, "You know what I think saved you?" "What?" "You finally stopped asking other people to tell you who you were." That stayed with me. Because she was right. The hardest lesson in this entire experience had nothing to do with money, business, property, or inheritance. The hardest lesson was learning that other people's opinions cannot become the foundation of your identity. If they do, you will spend your entire life chasing approval that never lasts. Somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to prove my worth and started remembering it. And that changed everything. If there is one lesson I carry from this chapter of my life, it is this: protect your finances, protect your future, and protect your peace. Keep good records. Have difficult conversations before they become urgent. Establish healthy boundaries before someone else decides where they belong. Most importantly, never allow anyone to convince you that your value depends on their approval. It does not. I also learned something about faith. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up when life falls apart and you keep moving forward anyway. I believe God gives us moments of clarity when we need them most. Looking back, I think Margaret understood that long before I did. She trusted that truth would eventually find its way into the light. And in the end, it did. If you are listening to this right now and someone has made you feel invisible, unimportant, or easy to replace, I want you to hear this from someone who has lived through it. Do not let another person's assumptions become your identity. Do not hand away your self-respect in exchange for acceptance. And do not forget that healing often begins the moment you stop chasing people who have already stopped listening. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand quietly in the truth and let time do the talking. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. Truly, life can be lonely sometimes, especially when the people closest to us become the source of our deepest disappointments. If this story has taught me anything, it is that none of us are as alone as we think we are. Somewhere out there, someone else understands exactly what you are carrying. My name is Richard Walker. I am 72 years old. And the core lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let anyone else define the value of a life you worked hard to build. On my desk today sits Margaret's handwritten letter inside a simple wooden frame. Every morning when I arrive at the office, it is the first thing I see. Not because it reminds me of what I almost lost, because it reminds me of what can never be taken away. And when I look at that letter catching the morning sunlight through my office window, I am reminded that the people who truly love us do not leave us power, wealth, or possessions. They leave us truth. If this story spoke to your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, second chances, and finding strength when life tests you, there are more stories waiting for you in this channel's playlist. Some will make you think, some may surprise you, and some may remind you that even after difficult chapters, life still has beautiful pages left to write. Until then, thank you for listening, and take care of yourself and the people who truly care about you.